Good morning. This is the regularly scheduled meeting of the Transportation and Public Works Committee. This day, February 18th, 2020. I'm Councilman Reich. I chair the committee, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Council members Johnson, Palmisano, Bender, Fletcher, and Gordon. And we're a full complement of the committee. We'll proceed with today's agenda, which we have 15 items, including hearings, consent items, and discussion. I'll go through the consent items. Committee members can pull them at their wish for further deliberation. Item 3 is the 2020 Minneapolis Open Streets, approving that list of routes and dates. 4 is the Highway 252 I-94 Min Pass Expansion Project. 5 is the contract with Employee Strategies for training for Public Works Department. 6 is the contract with Park Mobile for mobile payment application for on-street parking. 7 is the grant application for 2020 Metropolitan Council Regional Solicitation for federal transportation funds. 8 is the request for proposals for the Upper Harbor Terminal Redevelopment Project, Planning Engineering Services for street and public utility infrastructure. 9 is the Industrial Boulevard Multi-Use Trail, an appropriation increase, the amounts listed. 10 is the President's Bicycle Boulevard layout approval. 11 is the bid for First Street North over Bassett Creek Tunnel Repair Project. 12 is the bid for the Fridley Softening Plant I Conduit Stop Logs Project. 13 is the bid for upgrades on Americans with Disabilities Act pedestrian ramps. 14 is the bids for the Leamington Ramp Escalator Removal Project. I will move all items with the exception of the 94 item, which one was that again? Item 4. So I'll move all items, and then item 4, I'll note to the clerk that we'll move without recommendation, if that pleases the committee. Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that suggestion and just want to comment really briefly on item 4.
Oh, please do.
Thank you. This is a resolution about this project on Highway 252 and I-94, and I think both of us have been in conversations with our colleagues from wards 4 and 5, but neither of them could make it to committee today. They're not on the committee, so I think this forwarding without recommendation will give us a chance to make sure that their feedback is fully incorporated and that they would both be there at council to make any comment that they would wish to on this resolution then.
I fully appreciate that. And Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't need to pull it for discussion, but I do want to make a brief comment on item number 10. This has been a long time coming and something that people are very excited about, and I just wanted to recognize the work that staff did. This went through many, many iterations. And received a lot of community feedback, more community feedback on this, and particularly the intersection at Hennepin and 5th than probably any other project that's happened in Ward 3 this year. And the layout that we're approving today is extremely responsive to that feedback. I think it solves a lot of the problems for a very complex intersection with a lot of uses. And I think it's going to feel safer and more efficient for every mode of travel moving forward. So I'm very excited about this work. I want to thank the county for their collaboration with us on this and just recognize good work where it's happening. This is an exciting thing to vote on.
I appreciate highlighting that. Every year it's almost like a religious ceremony when we have the bike to work and we go to that intersection and lament the condition of that intersection. And so I echo your comments. I appreciate you calling that out. And now it's going to be much safer and easier for me to visit Ward 3. So a lot of upsides. Well, with that, we have our items before us, knowing one's going forward without recommendation. Is there approval of that? All in favor say aye. Aye. Dissenting nay. Those carry forward as discussed, and now we can move into our public hearings. Good morning, Director Hutchinson.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. We have 2 public hearings today. Mike Kennedy, the Director of Transportation Maintenance and Repair, will present information on both, and I will introduce Mike for both items at once. The first is First Avenue South Street resurfacing, and the second is 4th Street Northeast and Edison Residential Street resurfacing.
Good morning.
Morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Again, Mike Kennedy, Director of Transportation Maintenance and Repair for Public Works. The first of the 2 public hearings today is about First Avenue South Street resurfacing. On December 13th, 2019, the City Council designated the location, streets, and improvements proposed to be made in the 2020 street resurfacing program. The First Avenue Street resurfacing project is included in this 2020 program. The project is on First Avenue South, as you can see on the map. It's a municipal state aid street from Lake Street to 40th. Various segments of the street is actually built in about 3 different sections over several years, and the weighted average PCI is 62 for the whole segment. Public Works is also planning to implement pedestrian and bicycle improvements along either or both First Avenue and Blaisdell Avenue as part of what's known as the Whittier-Lyndale Bikeway project in 2021. The planning, design, and outreach of these pedestrian and bicycle improvements will be conducted in 2020. The First Avenue resurfacing needs to be completed in 2020 to address the rapidly deteriorating pavement condition, but it is the first part of the larger Whittier-Lyndale project. This project may eventually result in changes to the bike lanes along this portion of First Avenue South. So the 2020 resurfacing project will simply restore the existing bike lanes on First Avenue, and that could be easily modified in 2021 if and as needed. There would be no additional assessments associated with the Whittier-Lyndale pedestrian project in 2022, that would be. The special assessments, the proposed street resurfacing and special assessments were determined by applying the 2020 uniform assessment rate to the land area of benefited parcels located within the street influence zone. These assessments were not calculated based on the project cost alone. The city uses a formula that combines influence area with an annually established uniform assessment rate. The formula is carefully considered and applied by city staff and is intended to account and reflect for each individual project's value to the benefited properties. The 2020 rates that we are using are 66 cents per square foot for non-residential and 22 cents for residential properties. We did have, Public Works did host a community meeting on Wednesday, February 12th at the Central Gym, and there were a few folks that attended that. So today, our recommendation is passage of a resolution ordering the work to proceed and adopting the special assessments in the amount of $285,232.23 for the First Avenue Street resurfacing project, and passage of a resolution requesting the Board of Estimate and Taxation to authorize city's issuance and sale of assessments bond in the said amount. That's my presentation. If there's any questions, we can take that.
Are there any questions per the staff presentation? Seeing none, I will open the public hearing. Anyone signed in? Anyone wish to come forward? Anyone wish to come forward for public hearing item number 1? Seeing no one, I will close the public hearing and move the item as described. Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This project is in an area close by to Ward 10, and I just wanted to note that we hear a lot from constituents, I think, in this general corridor about bicycle infrastructure connections, and just wanted to note that separate from this resurfacing project, there's discussions with Public Works about how to connect these southern bikeway routes into downtown. So we really appreciated being able to work on that, even though it's not like specifically combined with the resurfacing conversations, that those separate discussions are happening about the protected bikeway network through this corridor.
Thank you. Any further discussion? See none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Dissenting nay. That item carries. We can move to item 2.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Our second public hearing today is about the 4th Street Northeast and Edison residential resurfacing project. Again, these projects were designated in December of 2019 as part of the 2020 street resurfacing program. You can see on the map the project boundaries. We essentially have a section of 4th Street Northeast and then the Edison residential paving project neighborhood. I won't go through the whole special assessments discussion again. It's for the same reasons. We use the uniform assessment rate and using the same rates as we did for the previous project. So our recommendation today is passage of a resolution ordering the work to proceed and adopting the special assessments in the amount of $226,632.44 for this project, and passage of a resolution requesting the Board of Estimate and Taxation to authorize the city's issuance and sale of assessment bonds in that amount. And that's my presentation, and if there are any questions, we can take those.
Thank you. Any questions per the presentation from staff? Seeing none, I will open the public hearing. This is public hearing number 2. We do have someone signed in. It's Mary Jane and John Rudnick. If you want to come forward and state your name and address for the record and make comment.
My name is Mary Jane Rudnick, and I live on the corner of 22nd and Madison Street Northeast. I've been there for 47 years, and I've never come across anything like this letter that we got. You guys want over $1,000 from me to fix your roads and, for the resurfacing. Now, behind my house, over by the tracks, they had that big area there, and they put up 3 great, big, humongous apartments. 3 big buildings, and each apartment building has got over 100 units in there. So that's over 300 units per, for the whole area. And because of that, I'm getting a bill. I mean, the guy that is building that, he's the one that should be paying for this, because there's going to be all these extra people using those roads, and there was nothing the matter with the roads before. Really, I mean, I can't afford it. Social Security checks go up $8 a year. It went up $8 a year. So, I mean, what can I do? And I really don't want to pay a bill of over $1,000 for the roads, that I don't think that I should have to.
I think you can discuss with staff there are payment options you may be eligible for, and then we'll have staff make comment on some of the points that you raise.
And where is that?
There's this gentleman right there.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you. Anyone else wish to come forward? Say your name and address for the record.
Good morning, Council. My name is Joseph Waters. I represent 664 22nd Avenue Northeast, which is known as Firefighters Hall and Museum. I have a question about the resurfacing project itself. How long is it going to take? The reason I have that question is I have one entrance to get in and out, and most of our business is done on the weekend, so I'm curious about the time factor of the resurfacing project on 22nd Avenue.
Yeah, we'll definitely answer those questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to come forward? Anyone else wish to come forward? If staff would come forward and address some of the points made. I think there's a notion about the condition, need for repair. And then in terms of properties being assessed, I would imagine even if it's a property that's being recently built or being built, they would still be subject to an assessment commensurate with their influence zone. So maybe some clarification on that point. And then in terms of the beloved Fire Hall Museum, we want to make sure they're accommodated in terms of their access needs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, this is a standard resurfacing project. This is the normal way that we fund these. It's a combination of special assessments to abutting properties using the influence area method. There is also a component of net debt bonds, which comes from general property taxes. So this is the standard way we do it. Any properties within the influence area of the project would be assessed the appropriate rate, be it commercial or residential. And as far as how much those folks affect the payment, and because it's a new project, does not come into play here. Mm-hmm. But this is how we fund the resurfacing projects. As far as payment goes, there is potential for a deferment of special assessments may be obtained by showing hardship for any homestead property owned by a person 65 years or older or retired by a virtue of permanent or total disability. And you can talk with our folks right here afterwards, and they can tell you about that if you're interested in something like that. So, and the condition of the roads, these roads are kind of a prime state here for the resurfacing. They are right in the sweet spot for what we need to do. As far as how long the project takes, this is resurfacing is much less intrusive than, say, a full reconstruction would be. Typically, it's a day or two. They'll see some work possibly done to replace some curb and gutter. At some time later, they'll see a day or two work on disruption and posting of no parking for the milling operations, and then another day or so for the pavement work. So if the gentleman would like to contact our project managers, we'd be happy to talk more about them, and they will be happy to try to accommodate any parking needs or access needs that he has. So we'd be happy to talk with them.
That's very good. Appreciate that accommodation. And then in terms of the overall condition, you mentioned that it's due, this area has an overall condition that makes it very prime for this treatment. So I think those are all good clarifications. With that, and definitely work with the citizens here to let them know their payment options. We have Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did get a question from a constituent that I think got into the record about drainage and asking sort of how much should they expect improvements where right now water runs and pools in their driveway. Is this proposed work going to resolve that issue? I can certainly understand someone's frustration at being billed for work that doesn't resolve the primary concern that they have about the street that's being repaired. So can you just help me set expectations a little bit about what this work does and doesn't do?
Sure, Mr. Chair and Councilmember Fletcher, I'm very familiar with exactly the location. I think it's 1305 4th Street Southeast. What's happening there, the gentleman is asking or said that there's been a lot of street work that has affected the drainage there. Really, that probably is not what is affecting the drainage. The problem is he's had the curb and gutter in front of his property has sunken. This is very typical for some of these old streets, cause what we call these bird baths or low spots. Very difficult to address those. Generally speaking, our resurfacing projects do not address drainage in the gutters. If there are some extraordinary conditions, we may go in, and in fact, in front of that property, we have preliminary identified that we may do some curb replacement there. Part of the problem is we don't know if we can get it up high enough in order to get it over his driveway apron. Quite often, a lot of what happens in these situations, and this happens all across the city in these projects, is we just move the water someplace else. But it should at least make it less deep and not as intrusive, and hopefully we can resolve most of it. But yes, there shouldn't be expectations that this will solve it. But this is very typical for these kinds of projects. We're not addressing general curb and gutter to really get all the drainage to work. Again, that's a reconstruction project.
Thank you. And then I will comment. I made some initial comment when I was first presented with this by staff in terms of how nearby projects, notably Monroe, had been very sensitive to opportunities around safe routes to schools. Even though this is not a reconstruct, there's still things that were achieved that were very, very well welcomed to those ends, and I know that coordination will be moving forward as well. So I always appreciate those opportunities being taken advantage of as well. Any further conversation? Seeing none, I will move the item before us as described by staff. All in favor say aye. Aye. Dissenting nay. That carries, and we can now go to the discussion item. Director Hutchinson.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, our final item is a discussion item. This is to present information that we have received between our first presentation of the draft Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, Transition Plan for Public Works. It has been open for public comment since we first presented in November. I was going to say December, but it's November. We've received the comments and have made changes to the plan. I would like to make a short commentary and say that our work with the community, specifically the advocacy community surrounding Americans with disabilities, will continue throughout the adoption of the plan and as we begin to implement and in future iterations and updates to this plan. And we have appreciated very much the feedback that we've received and are looking forward to getting started on much needed work in the city. Kelsey Fote is a transportation planner in transportation planning and will make the presentation. Kelsey.
Good morning, Chair, members of the committee. My name is Kelsey Fote. I'm a transportation planner with the Transportation Planning and Programming Division in Public Works. I'm here today to share the revised ADA Transition Plan for Public Works. A couple things to go over today, a little bit more context, what feedback we heard on the draft plan, and changes that were made to the draft plan in response to the feedback that we received. As Robin mentioned, Director Hutchinson mentioned, the draft plan was released in November of 2019. We had it open for a 45-day comment period. We hosted an open house. We had an online survey, met with several of our advisory committees, including the Minneapolis Advisory Committee on People with Disabilities, the Minneapolis Pedestrian Advisory Committee, Minneapolis Committee on Aging, and the Minneapolis Bicycle Advisory Committee. We also received a few phone calls and emails to staff about the draft plan itself. While we didn't receive a large number of comments on the draft plan, many of those that we did receive were very detailed. I'll go into some of those details in a minute, but just to recap on the purpose and the legislative mandate of an ADA transition plan. The Americans with Disabilities Act is a federal law that was passed in 1990. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability. The ADA is divided into 5 chapters. Title II, which requires broadly that local government agencies provide equal access to programs and services that they provide, and provides detailed regulations to fulfill this obligation. It's a wide-reaching federal law with important local impacts, as more than 1 in 10 residents in Minneapolis have a disability. As part of these regulations, local government agencies with 50 or more employees are required to have an ADA transition plan if structural changes to facilities are required to meet ADA standards. The purpose of a transition plan is to identify physical barriers for accessibility, establish priorities, and develop an implementation plan for removing barriers and achieving compliance with ADA standards and requirements. It's important to note that ADA transition plans are by design living documents. They are meant to be a planning and programming tool that is updated periodically as new information is gathered and physical barriers are removed. The revised version of the ADA transition plan has 5 chapters and an executive summary. The first chapter provides an overview of federal regulations and how the city meets those regulations. The second focuses on what we heard through public engagement. The third is called a self-evaluation and outlines barriers that were identified through this process. The fourth sets up a prioritization methodology for removing barriers, and the last chapter provides an overview of the methods for how barriers are and will continue to be removed. There are many departments involved in ADA planning at the city. The Neighborhood and Community Relations Department, or NCR, manages a citywide plan that comprehensively addresses programs and services at the city. It's called the ADA Action Plan. Additionally, NCR staffs the Minneapolis Advisory Committee for People with Disabilities. The committee advises staff and city officials on matters pertaining to the ADA and ways in which the city can be more accessible for all persons. There are 2 separate and supporting plans that inform the ADA Action Plan. One of these is the Public Works Plan, which covers physical accessibility, physical access to the city's public right-of-way. The other is a similar plan managed by Finance and Property Services, which covers physical access to city-owned and leased facilities. The ADA Transition Plan for Public Works identifies 4 types of infrastructure that are crucial for providing access in the public right-of-way. That includes pedestrian curb ramps, accessible pedestrian signal systems, or APS, sidewalks, and street crossings. Within Minneapolis, there are several other public agencies that control right-of-way or own infrastructure in the city. That includes the Minnesota Department of Transportation, Hennepin County, Minneapolis Parks and Recreation Board, and Metro Transit. These agencies have their own transition plans that cover their facilities and the right-of-way. This plan covers Minneapolis's right-of-way that is managed or owned by the city. This is not the first ADA transition plan for public works. An earlier version was developed in 2012. The intention of this plan is to replace that 2012 version with this updated plan. The 2012 plan is being updated for a number of reasons. As a living document, transition plans are meant to be updated periodically. Additionally, new requirements for the upcoming regional solicitation require the agencies have an approved plan that covers the public right-of-way by the application period in April. The 2012 plan was never formally adopted, so this plan seeks to meet that mandate. The 2012 plan included a commitment to complete a comprehensive inventory on pedestrian curb ramps. That inventory was since completed, and that data has been incorporated into this plan. Lastly, the 2012 plan is being updated to support and integrate with other planning efforts and further the city's commitment to the ADA. While we have several ADA plans at the city, ADA plans are not the only plans and policies that impact accessibility of the public right-of-way. ADA plans are designed to answer to the regulations prescribed by the federal law and answer the questions of whether the city complies with the minimum standards detailed in these regulations. Several other key policy plans work in tandem with ADA plans to provide a transportation network that promotes safety, accessibility, and aligns with city goals. These include the Vision Zero Action Plan, which was recently adopted, and the Transportation Action Plan, which is a 10-year action plan to guide future planning, design, and implementation of transportation projects across the city. Both of these plans were and are being developed in coordination with the ADA Transition Plan. As far as what we heard on the draft plan, there are a few key themes in the feedback we received. There was a desire to see improvements for scooter share. These varied from the need to increase enforcement of scooters blocking the right-of-way to dedicating more space for scooters to operate and park. A need to add timelines to the recommendations listed in the plan and to simplify the language of those recommendations. A need to complete additional data collection, especially for sidewalks, street crossings, and evaluate APS data to include within the plan. There were also several suggestions on how to include improved winter maintenance, accessible pedestrian signal design, and traffic signal operations for pedestrians. In response to the feedback that we received, we added an executive summary to summarize the intent of the transition plan and highlight those key recommendations for improvement. Timelines and milestones were added for each of the recommendations to clearly identify next steps and how and when each of the recommendations are expected to be completed. We analyzed and added more information on where sidewalks exist and the approximate sidewalk widths along city right-of-way, but maintained a recommendation to collect additional data to both confirm this existing data and expand upon it. We added more information on what guidance the ADA provides on winter maintenance and the city's existing practices on sidewalk, snow, and ice enforcement and corner clearing. We added transit as a criteria to prioritize improvements in addition to pedestrian needs and community demographics as outlined in Chapter 4 of the plan. The recommendations in the plan outline a path forward to collect or evaluate inventory data and make improvements in the public right-of-way. Most of the recommendations outlined in the plan are anticipated to be completed in the next few years, but just to highlight a few of the recommendations planned for this year, we plan to make significant improvements to the pedestrian curb ramp inventory tool to collect more accurate data, and that corresponds with the latest curb ramp standards. Finish digitizing data on accessible pedestrian signals and evaluate this data against current standards and guidance to include within the plan. Pilot data collection for sidewalks and street crossings to determine a methodology that will collect information needed for the ADA plan and allow us to prioritize improvements through our data-driven capital programming process. As these and other recommendations are completed and infrastructure continues to be improved, we will continue to update and add to this ADA transition plan. And that's my presentation. I'll stand for questions.
Are there any initial questions for staff? Council Member Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had several questions. I appreciate the presentation. I was struck on the first page by more than 1 in 10 residents have a disability in our city, so more than 40,000 residents. Yet I noticed that we had between the online survey and the in-person meeting, only 10 people show up. Why do you think, I compare that with something like 2040 where we had tens of thousands of comments, and certainly I understand that there's varying levels of interest in the different topics, but it seems off by multiple magnitudes. Are there thoughts on how the community engagement was approached and how we might be able to do better with that to get more feedback?
Sure. Chair Reich, members of the committee, I would say that we had a much more robust participation from people in the beginning of the process when we asked specifically what barriers were of most impact for them. When we got to the stage when we were bringing out the draft transition plan, it seemed, I think, a little less real for people, a little harder to engage with. So that may be the reason for why we didn't receive as many comments.
Gotcha. On the diagram, I know you showed that. I also was thinking with the diagram, you know, you mentioned that we need more data on sidewalks, street crossings, and signals. That seems to me like that covers most of that diagram of the city infrastructure in terms of how somebody would handle it. I guess, why did we fall so far behind on this? Because we had an earlier plan in 2018, so 8 years have passed since then. I would imagine that the data could have been collected in that time. And then as we're thinking ahead here, what are our, I know you touched briefly and kind of said it sounded like the next few years to collect data, but do we have any more specific timelines, and how can we really ramp that up? Because that seems like a really huge missing component when I'm going through this, where we say when data becomes available, when we collect it, we don't have the data, determining an approach to get better data sets. We don't have crosswalk inventory or width, running slope, or obstructions. So there's just a lot of missing information, it seems like, and that, so we're not really influencing those parts in the plan. Can you speak more to that?
Sure. Chair Reich, Councilmember. We in the 2012 plan, it only included recommendation to include an inventory of pedestrian curb ramps. This plan includes a recommendation to collect an inventory on the rest of the features that you mentioned. We do have good data on some of those features, but we would be looking to expand upon that. For sidewalks, for instance, we have data on our widths and where sidewalks exist throughout the city, but we would need to collect things like cross slopes and where obstructions are. So we have a plan outlined to do that through this plan. For APS, we have that data, but it is yet to be digitized and evaluated, but we expect to do that in the year, so we should have that pretty soon.
Are the timelines in the plan for that? Do you have specific timelines cited here under these?
Yep, they are in the recommendations table. It's both in the executive summary and in Chapter 5 for reference.
For getting the data online, gotcha. Okay. I think that's my questions for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate all this work. And it seems like they were really fleshing out this plan much more than we ever have before, so I really appreciate that. I was concerned when I got an email from one of the members of our committee, Person with Disabilities Committee, with some concerns about it. It sounded like Councilmember Johnson might have been trying to look at some of those as well. Have you seen that, the email? I mean, he talks about that we need to have assess each component into compliant and non-compliant and have a timeline and understand the costs of making those improvements. I think, and also he wanted to be clear that I think he was saying the advisory committee didn't necessarily endorse the plan or not. So I guess, just from my position as a policymaker, well, that's a concern. I'm hoping and expecting that our staff is certainly working with the committee and working with him to address those, and maybe can help clarify where some of them are already in the plan, and also how quickly we're going to work to get them in the plan. And maybe if you could just comment a little more directly on that, it'll help me be confident about it.
Sure. Chair Wright, Councilmember Gordon. We expect to continue to work with the committees on how to flesh out the plan more. We do have some of those interim steps outlined through the recommendations, and we've seen the same kind of feedback from the committees. I think there are pretty high expectations of what should be in this plan, and we intend to do our best to meet those goals.
And I can't speak for the entire council, but we don't shy away from high expectations, and I think we should meet them too. And what I think we all want to hear from our advisory committees is this is I don't know, we fully support 100%, but it's also really helpful when they poke us and say, you didn't quite make it. So I have to say that those kinds of emails are also welcome, and they're really important.
Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think along similar lines, I think we've heard a real provocation about a sense of urgency. Mm-hmm. I think we've heard a real push to make sure that this is a priority. And I was thinking back to last year's budget conversations, and I don't remember this being something that we were debating, should we fund or not. I don't remember it being something that came forward as a priority. And so I just want to, first of all, own that I didn't ask about it, right? That at least in my role as one of the 13 who could have raised this up, I didn't do that. It wasn't front of mind enough that I said, where's the funding for our ADA plan? But I do just want to sort of ask, what will it take to get to some specificity? This feels like a very abstract conversation in some ways. I feel very, it's very easy for me to say in the abstract, of course, I want us to make the city accessible for everyone with disabilities, but until we have dollar amounts to put on that, until we have a sense of what's the budgetary ask of us and what are we prioritizing, it's not a very real conversation. So I guess I'm wondering what it'll take for us to get to some of the budget conversation that I assume is a part of achieving this. I assume this isn't something that we can sort of naturally achieve.
Sure. Yes, thank you for the question, Chair Wright, committee members. We actually are looking to pilot a sidewalk data collection effort with one of our neighborhood reconstruction and resurfacing areas likely this summer in order to pin down that very question for you. If you recall, several years ago, we did an automated data collection effort on our streets citywide in order to improve our pavement condition data set for the city. And we'd like to try to use that effort for the sidewalks as well, but it's a very new technology to use on the sidewalks. And we need to pilot that in order to see how that would work on the sidewalks and what the cost would be. So we want to try to do that in a small subset of the city in order to see what the data looks like when it comes forward and what that cost would be so that we could see what that would look like for citywide.
Thank you. And when would you expect that pilot to bring back something that we can act on?
Mr. Chair, committee members, as I said, we were looking to try to do that pilot likely this summer. If not this summer, it would be next summer with one of our larger neighborhood resurfacing and reconstruction areas, but we're hoping to do that this summer. So it would be towards the end of the summer when we would have that information.
Thank you. And one more question, if you. One of the asks from one of my constituents was actually to vote no on this until we have a little more detail. And I guess I wanted to ask, what are the consequences of not approving this plan today and saying we want some more information about what the resources would be required, or what does it enable us to move forward with to pass this plan today, knowing that part of what the plan says is that we've got a bunch of additional things to figure out. Help me kind of think through what's the right path here, given that we've identified some areas where people are asking for more information.
Mr. Chair, committee members, passing this plan today does a couple things. It gives us the plan that we need in order to move forward to continue this work. It also clears the path for us to submit our federal funding applications for the regional solicitation that we need to move forward with in the very near term. As Kelsey noted, the ADA transition plan is a living document, and so we continue to work on it and update it and use it going forward. It doesn't answer all the questions with the data right now, but it clears the path for us to continue to do that work and continue to answer those questions. So we have a lot of data on our sidewalks. We know we need more data, and we're continuing to look for those opportunities to collect that data. And the pilot that we want to do this summer is one of those opportunities. If we don't approve the plan today, it really just sets us back in our work.
Thank you. Councilmember or Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is a really important discussion, and I think it reflects, growing interest in all of the different ways that we're investing in our street system, our public right-of-way, to make it more accessible for all users. So I think it's meant in that spirit of really wanting to support the work. I've been kind of working on transportation issues for a long time, and I think the role of ADA transition plans has evolved in the field, I think in a good way, which is to be more integrated with our with the rest of capital spending. I think in the past, just my own observation, not necessarily of Minneapolis, but of generally of transportation and public works agencies, the ADA transition plan was kind of like its own thing. And I think if you went through and tried to catalog all of the capital budget it would take to implement, ADA accessible sidewalks in the full system, the amount of money would be really extraordinary and overwhelming. And I think over the last 20 years, for example, the field has evolved to really think about ADA transition plans as more integrated with the traditional capital improvement plan to be more integrated with things like our complete streets policy, our Vision Zero policies, our neighborhood transportation plans and resurfacing and reconstruction projects. So I think a little bit of what we're noting here is that we're in this time where those kinds of plans are coming together more than they have in the past. So I'm excited to hear that we're continuing to evolve how we're doing capital programming to be more proactive and more integrated. The fact that it is not unique to Minneapolis. And I think, so all that to say, in terms of like, how do we go forward from here? I think what I'm hearing from my colleagues and which what I would support too is that, this plan, I think in its current form reflects a lot of progress that has been made. And I think there's a lot of support to go farther and continue that integration, whether it's through the pilot this summer or even more aggressive work through the budget or whatever colleagues would want to work with the department on. For me, I think I also am hearing from constituents, just us wanting to move faster and do more quickly. We continue to hear about snow clearance in the wintertime as an ADA and accessibility issue. We continue to hear about things that may not be specifically in this plan, but are captured in other areas of our policy or planning work or in other areas of our capital improvements. So I would feel comfortable myself approving this plan today, but also knowing that we have a lot of work ahead and that some of it is captured in these other areas. And maybe it makes sense to, ask for a kind of more integrated update that integrates ADA with these other things, maybe more details on the pilot when those become available so that we can continue to track how all of these things are coming together. I think the Transportation Action Plan, once we have the draft and we start to go through that approval process, my prediction is that plan will start to even more affect how we do capital programming in the city, reflecting this move toward being more proactive on pedestrian and bicycle safety, being more proactive on ADA accessibility, and making all of that more integrated. Again, the kind of older status quo of being that the capital improvement program was a list of resurfacing and reconstruction projects that had a lot to do with pavement quality and tended to have a lot to do with vehicular movement. And we're really starting to evolve our capital programming more and more in cities around the country, including Minneapolis, to be more proactive and more values-based in this complete streets lens, in the ADA lens, in the accessibility lens. So again, kind of a long way to say, I think if the committee approves this today, if the council approves this plan, it would be seen as, another step forward, but that there seems to be a lot of interest in next steps and implementation.
Thank you. Any other comments? Just pivoting from what Council President Bender said, I think just the interest alone in the conversation generated, we would want to come back with an update to the committee. Curious to see the work that's been done, to see how it does get integrated moving forward, how it does evolve even in a one-year time period. Any pilots that we do, any conclusions from that would be clearly of great interest. So just in the notion of having interesting committee meetings and an engaged committee, I think this should be a great candidate for a frequent touching of base as things progress. I think the comments colleagues made have been pretty spot on. Council President Bender's kind of that overview, I think, really puts the perspective of what we're doing. We have elevated this work. As a matter of fact, it's elevated to the pinnacle of our work based on our complete streets. And so when something's the top priority, it gets treated in a different way than when it's sort of a tack on to the main work, as expounded by Council President Bender, which was a typical way of approaching things, not unique to Minneapolis. And so prioritizing, integrating in a more elevated way definitely takes some shifting. And in terms of the conversation around budget, when we're talking about acceleration of work, highlighting of work, saying that it's the summit of our work, it should be reflected thusly, and I think that's work that we can do as a body in support of the department to do what it takes once we have identified specifically what it takes to accelerate this work, because clearly there's a public demanding it. And Director Hutchinson, do you have something to add?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. for your comments. This is a vital piece of work for the Department of Public Works, and I would like to recognize that plans that leave questions about what's next are not bad plans, they're honest plans. And that an honest planning process uncovers two things. One, a path forward on what you can accomplish and what it will take. And two, what you cannot accomplish today, but you know that you need to, and that's the path you build. This plan does both things, and I want to thank staff, Kelsey in particular, for taking on an incredibly important project, for doing it with such integrity, and for approaching it in such an honest way. What we know and what we don't yet know are both incredibly important components of any honest planning process.
Well, thank you for highlighting that, and I think it's not lost on the committee that this report and your approach is definitely new, different, but needed, and so we really appreciate that and do not take it for granted. If there's no further comments, I would adopt our plan as it's before us and described by staff and discussed by the committee. All in favor say aye. Aye. Dissenting nay. That carries, and that concludes our business today. Thank you. We are adjourned.